If I could have your attention, please, we'll get started. Thank you, everyone. It's really pleased you're all here. I'm Larry Mohn, president of the Manhattan Institute, and thank you. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Jason Riley today. As most of you know, Jason is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a regular columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and a commentator for Fox News. In his new book, False Black Power, Jason offers a critique of civil rights leaders and their prioritization of pure political power, which he argues has failed to produce significant results for African Americans. The book also includes thoughtful responses to Jason's arguments from two leading black intellectuals, John McWhorter and Glenn Loury. It's a slender book, but it packs a powerful punch. As one blogger noted, what makes this book shine is the clarity of its logic and accessibility of its writing style. Just as Fred Astaire made it look easy to dance, so does Riley express his mastery through elegance so natural that it seems effortless. Naomi, how did you get to write that? I'm so sorry. All right, there you go. And it's available for just $10, $6 on Kindle. Now, Jason may not get rich with this book, but hopefully he will open a few minds. Please join me in welcoming the fearless and the peerless Jason Riley.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Larry, and I'm glad you told a few jokes. I was going to start with a joke about C-SPAN, where I appeared recently. Then I found out C-SPAN was going to be covering this event, and my wife advised me to beg off. So this will be a joke-free presentation, because that's really all I had. So thank you. Thank you, Larry. False black power, what am I talking about? In a nutshell, what I'm saying is that Barack Obama needed black voters far more than black voters needed Barack Obama. And that's not a personal attack on the former president. You could substitute in the name of any black politician, and the statement would still hold true. And that's what I'm trying to get at in this book. It started out as a column. It grew into a longer essay, and then eventually the short book that was recently published. But my intention was to make a fairly simple point, which is that political activity is not the most effective way of advancing a group economically. A racial or ethnic group's political success does not automatically lead to economic success. One does not flow naturally from the other. It's hardly an original observation, but I think it's an important one that is regularly ignored by civil rights leaders and black political leaders who practice identity politics, urging blacks to vote as a bloc, favoring candidates of their own racial or ethnic background, and so forth. And I thought the end of the Obama presidency was an especially good time to reiterate the limits of this strategy, which has been in place for more than 50 years now. Since the 1960s, black leaders have really prioritized the integration of political institutions. And they've had a great deal of success in doing this on their own terms. By the early 1980s, major U.S. cities with large black populations, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Washington, Philadelphia, had elected black mayors. Between 1970 and 2010, the number of black elected officials grew from fewer than 1,500 to more than 10,000 in this country, including, of course, a black president. In addition, we saw a proliferation of black police chiefs and school superintendents and council members and state legislatures. Racially gerrymandered voting districts were created to ensure the election of blacks to Congress, and so forth. The problem is that all of this political clout has never really paid off economically for the black poor, which is what we were told would happen. You look at how the black underclass fared in Coleman Young's Detroit, or Marion Barry's Washington, D.C., or Sharp James's Newark. As my Manhattan Institute colleague Fred Siegel has noted, these black mayors created these unbeatable political machines in the name of helping the poor, yet the poor became even more impoverished on their watch. Mississippi has long boasted more black elected officials than any other state in the country, yet it continues to have one of the highest black poverty rates in the country. There have been case studies of places like Atlanta in the 1970s and 80s, for example, where under black mayors, the city implemented racial preference policies for hiring black city workers and black contractors. What happened? Well-off blacks in those places became better off. But average income blacks were left behind, and the black poor actually lost ground. And that's been the story nationwide. In an era of increasing black political clout, not to mention affirmative action and racial set-asides, the black underclass has lost ground, both in absolute terms and relative to the white underclass. In the 1970s and 80s, and even into the 90s, the poorest 20% of blacks saw their incomes decline at more than double the rate of comparable whites. This history, I think, should have served to temper expectations for the first black president. Without taking away anything from Barack Obama's historic accomplishment or the country's widespread sense of pride in the racial progress that his election symbolized, the reality is that there was little reason to believe that a black president was the answer to racial inequalities or the problems of the black poor. I think the expectations were set way too high. On the racial front and on other fronts, I read an article over the weekend in the New York Times which counted as a failure the Obama administration's inability to end racial or to end income inequality. And I said, wow, he was supposed to do that? I mean, the expectations, I just think, were off the charts on many fronts, but particularly on the racial front and what his presidency would be able to do. And sure enough, black-white gaps in household incomes, poverty, home ownership, and other measures all widened during Obama's term in office. The job situation for blacks did improve towards the end of his second term, but blacks did not see their average unemployment rate fall below double digits until the third month of Obama's seventh year in office. So now we have more evidence that the proliferation of black politicians in recent decades, which now includes a twice-elected black president, has done little to narrow racial gaps in employment and income and academic achievement and other areas. This is not to say, of course, that blacks should stay out of politics or not run for office or not engage politically. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm questioning is whether gaining political influence should continue to play such a central role in the strategy of black leaders when it comes to advancing blacks economically, or whether their focus should be on other areas. That's because most groups in America and elsewhere who have risen economically have done so with little or no political influence. And groups that have enjoyed early political success have tended to rise more slowly. So it's not that you can't take the political route. You can, but chances are you're going to rise more slowly than you would taking other routes. Germans, Jews, Italians, Asians are among those who saw economic gains precede political gains in America. And it's a pattern you also see internationally. Ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia, the English in Argentina, Jews in Britain, among many other examples, all prospered economically while mostly shunning politics. Even if a group had the ability to wield political influence, they didn't always choose to do so. German immigrants to the U.S. in colonial times were not lacking in numbers. In fact, there was there were so many of them that Benjamin Franklin was complaining about how many there were in Pennsylvania as far back as the 1750s. He said, "Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly become so numerous as to Germanize us instead of us Anglifying them?" Nevertheless, Germans, many of whom were bribed as indentured servants and focused initially on paying off the cost of their voyage, had other priorities and were well known for avoiding politics. And it's a trait they brought with them to this country, because we know that German immigrants in everywhere from Australia to Brazil followed the same pattern, basically shunning politics and establishing themselves economically first. Germans began entering politics only after they had risen economically. A counterexample, and the example that blacks have followed most closely, would be the Irish, whose rise from poverty, I should say, was especially slow, given that you had these Irish-run political organizations in places like Boston and Philadelphia and New York, who were dominating local government. The Irish had more political success in the U.S. than any other ethnic group historically after they arrived. Yet the Irish were the slowest rising group of all European immigrants to America. The political power of a relatively small number of Irish elected officials had little impact on the economic progress of most Irish Americans. In fact, it wasn't until those political machines started to decline in influence that we saw the swelling of the Irish middle class, to the point where today average Irish incomes and educational attainment and so forth all exceed the national average. Viewed against this history, many blacks were expecting Obama's presidency to deliver more prosperity than political clout tends to deliver for a group in the U.S. or anywhere else. The black experience in America, I should add, is of course different from the Irish experience, which in turn is different from the Chinese or the German or the Jewish experience. Indeed, we can't really even generalize about the black experience here, because native blacks have patterns that differ from black immigrants from the West Indies, for example, or from Africa. But that doesn't mean that because we can't make perfect apples-to-apples comparisons, that we have nothing to learn from what other groups experienced, or that no comparisons can be made. Many different racial and ethnic minority groups have experienced various degrees of hardship in the U.S. and in other countries all over the world. And I think how those groups have dealt with those circumstances is something to study closely and draw lessons from going forward, even if the only lesson is to manage expectations. One of the clear lessons from this history is also that human capital, the collective skills and knowledge that create economic value, have proven to be far more important than political capital in getting ahead. A racial or ethnic group's culture, its attitudes, its habits, its values matter more, much more, than electing people who look like them. And that's reality helps to explain why blacks fared the way they did, not only in the Obama era, but also in the preceding decades. Prior to the 1960s and the first half of the 20th century, when blacks were more focused on developing their human capital, we saw racial gaps narrowing in incomes, educational attainment, representation in the skilled professions, and elsewhere. Blacks were not only making gains in absolute terms, they were also gaining on whites. The progress was slow, but it was steady. It was happening. Yet in the wake of Great Society welfare state expansions and the black leadership's shift to pursuing political power more fervently, we saw those previous gains slow, stall in some cases, reverse course even in other cases. Obama's election was the end product of a civil rights strategy that has prioritized political power, false power, in my view, to advance blacks. And 8 years later, we once again learned the limits of that strategy. I'll stop there and take any questions you might have. Thank you.
I will field questions from the audience. It's very important to wait till the microphone gets to you in this instance because we want the C-SPAN audience to hear your question as well as your fellow guests. All right? So, Mr. Stephen, wait for the microphone.
Thank you very much for that talk. How would you compare your experience
You're on.
with the debate 100 years ago between Booker T. Washington and Du Bois about how blacks can rise from poverty?
Well, I think the differences in the strategies between Du Bois and Washington have been a little bit exaggerated over the decades. There were more similarities, I think, than differences. Booker T. Washington did not reject civil rights or the importance of advancing, using the political system here to advance the race. And Du Bois didn't reject the type of industrial learning that Booker T. Washington wanted to focus on. But you do see the seeds there of something that blossomed in the post-civil rights period when it came to the choices that someone like Martin Luther King Jr. wanted to make and choices that more militant blacks wanted to go in, with the Black Power movement in particular. But the real difference, I think, between the old school leadership and today's leadership is also a mindset that is brought to the task. I think everyone from King to Du Bois to Washington and the NAACP in its early years were focused, their idea was that racism was the constant here. We're going to have to succeed notwithstanding it. The shift in attitude came in the second half, I think, of the 20th century, where the attitude became, we must see racism vanquished from America before blacks can be held responsible for their own destiny. And that mindset is what has won the day, I think, and that is, in addition to this focus on political power, it's also that victim mindset that blacks have been encouraged to adopt and that political leaders play off of endlessly. I think that has also hampered progress.
Okay. Right here, Ed.
Gene Epstein, economics editor of Barron's. Two questions. You sound a little bit mild in your criticism of political clout. To what extent, first question is, to what extent, if any, would you specifically state that greater political clout is counterproductive to the advancement of blacks? Second, I was intrigued to learn that John McWhorter, among others, has a critical essay accompanying your book. To what extent is McWhorter, for example, differing from your view, and how might you respond to ways in which you might differ?
Well, on the first question, I think what tends to happen when you get a black leader who wants to play in politics is they become a politician, and then political concerns take precedence. So, for instance, you can take education as an example. School choice is hugely popular in the black community, particularly among the black poor. Polls off the charts, has for decades. Barack Obama gets in office and tries to shut down a school voucher program in D.C., tries to shut down a school voucher program in Louisiana. Why? Not because these programs aren't popular, not in demand. The charter school wait list is hundreds of thousands of kids long, many of whom are minorities on that list. He tries to shut it down because he has a political need to satisfy some people that helped him get elected, namely the teachers' unions, who don't like school choice. And he decides to do their bidding instead of this ethnic voting bloc that played a large role in electing him. His priorities shifted by necessity. He became a politician. And that, I think, is how you can get political clout can backfire on the group, on the neediest members of the group that have sent that person off to represent them politically. In terms of John's criticism, John's criticism was, well, part of it really surrounded, he thinks the racial debate in this country has shifted more to the deindustrialization of the country, and how he says the left's concerns, or the black intellectuals, to his mind, are really focused on blaming social pathologies in the ghetto on the absence of factory jobs, and that's what led to the current state of affairs. And that he thought I should have done more to talk about that in the book. And I think it's a fair point, and people like William Julius Wilson have been making this point for decades. I don't buy the argument. I think they get the sequence wrong when they say that. In other words, the social breakdown in the 1960s in inner cities preceded the flight of jobs. Detroit didn't riot after the factory jobs left. The riots came first. And so I think that's my problem with that deindustrialization argument that some have made. But that was some of what John was criticizing about the book. But by and large, he liked it.
Other questions? All right, right here. Please, if you're in the back, just make sure you raise your hand so that I can see you. Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
I want to thank you for your enlightening comments. I enjoy reading your op-ed pieces and your prior book. My question to you is a more personal one. I'd be interested in the reactions that you receive in the black community to your work.
Well, it depends on
Realizing that, of course, that's not monolithic.
right. Well, that is the point. I mean, it really depends on who you're talking about in the black community. If you're talking to clergymen or churchgoers sitting in pews, whether you're at HBCU talking to students, or whether you're at Wellesley or Amherst talking to members of the Black Student Union there, you're going to get three very different reactions. So it really does just depend on the audience, I would say.
I'm sure there are predominant.
Again, it depends. If you are speaking to people sympathetic to the NAACP's point of view and their methods of trying to help blacks, then you're going to get a negative response, because a lot of what I write about makes a lot of what the NAACP is talking about irrelevant, and perhaps even its existence today irrelevant. If the problems facing blacks today are not primarily racial barriers or racism per se, then there's not much use for an organization like that to continue saying the things they want to say. And to the extent that they're going to be out there advocating against, say, charter schools, which they recently did, they're doing more harm than good. They're not just being indifferent; they're actually doing harm. So it's going to vary. It's going to vary.
Okay, I just want to make sure. Okay, Michael Goodwin.
It's on. Thank you, Jason. A question about President Obama. Your comments about block voting and the example with the teachers union, I think, is well said, because the feeling I suspect he had in his campaign was, where are they going to go? Right? The black voters who elected me are going to stay with me. The teachers union might stray. Right. And a number of non-white people have made the point that after the Obama years, there will then be this awakening that black power is not what it's cracked up to be, that politically there must be other ways. What do you think that the Republicans, independents need to do to attract black voters so that they can have better integrated parties and that the country as a whole can be less divided racially?
I think they need to show up in these neighborhoods and introduce themselves. They've largely just written off this vote for many, many years. Now, you can quibble over why that is, whether you think it's deep-seated racism or some other factor, but it's political expediency. They didn't need this vote to win. And some in the party may look at Trump's success and go, we still don't need this vote to win. I mean, a lot of people in my camp over the years were saying the GOP has got to attract more Hispanics, the country's diversifying, they won't be able to win national elections. Trump proved everyone wrong on that front. There's an argument that he proved everyone wrong. I think I'd still push back a little bit, but I think if Republican candidates want to do better among black voters, they need to spend more time in black communities. They need to go to the barbershops and the grocery stores. They need to run political ads on black radio stations and during shows on television that black people watch or websites that they visit. I haven't seen that kind of concerted effort. You see it from time to time among individual candidates. Chris Christie did it in New Jersey when he got reelected in 2013, went into Camden, went into some of these cities, and did quite well with the black vote in his reelection. In the past, you've seen people like Richard Riordan out in LA do pretty well on that front. You see Stephen Goldsmith in Indianapolis. You see it here and here. Paul Ryan is someone who's traveled the country with people like Bob Woodson, a community leader who's been around for a long time, visited these neighborhoods, talked to them in the sort of Jack Kemp mode. Rand Paul has gone to black colleges and given speeches. I think those are good, but I think you need a much larger effort on the part of the party. And I think the party, if you remember that autopsy report after Romney lost, the party said, this is what we need to do going forward. And then you had this, political earthquake with Trump come along, and it all sort of went out the window.
Okay. Question back there?
To what degree do you think there's a role for the black elite in the private sector to try to mobilize the black community to, get a recognition of your view and to, disseminate that message?
There's a role. It depends. Many members of these elite, that elite group, I think, have become convinced that it is the government that put them in the position they are in today. In other words, I've spoken to groups of black professionals, black one percenters, who are convinced that but for affirmative action, but for racial preferences, their class of blacks would not exist. So you're still fighting a mindset there that the Democratic Party has done a brilliant job of pushing onto black America, not just encouraging dependence among low-income blacks, but even middle-class and upper-middle-class blacks have this dependent mindset that we wouldn't be where we are today but for big government. And so it is a challenge. It is a challenge.
Right over there. All right. There's one question over here, right? Okay.
Paul Linthurst. Charles Murray wrote in the 80s about the impact of welfare on the progress of the poor, and then later in the 90s about the impact of family disintegration. If you look at the situation as it is right now, have you thought about what could we do policy-wise so that the black poor at least resume the kind of progress they made in the 50s and early 60s?
Well, I think it's, from a government policy perspective, it's a question of what I'd like to see the government stop doing. It's not that a new program needs to come along. It's stop doing things that we know don't work. So if we have welfare programs or government assistance programs that have used to be safety nets, but now they've become lures and traps for blacks who spend generation after generation on government dependency, we need to think about the incentives that have been put in place regarding work. If we have kids trapped in failing schools, let the school models that we know work proliferate. Stop capping their growth. If we know that we have a lot of budding entrepreneurs in Brooklyn or up in Harlem who want to start their own jitney service or hair braiding store, cut the red tape, eliminate these occupational licensing requirements that hamper the growth of black businesses. So there are things I think that the government can do that can play a role. Mostly involves, I think, revisiting some of the programs that are out there, some of the policies that have been tried, and taking a more humble approach going forward.
Okay. Well, that's it. One more question, then we'll wrap it up.
Ed Hoffman. Jason, you may recall that Ronald Reagan got in trouble for going beyond what you said. He said that some of the people who are black leaders actually want the situation to remain bad or even get worse, because without the anger and resentment, they're out of a job. So did Reagan go too far in suggesting that any leaders had a vested interest in keeping the situation as it is? And secondly, are set-aside programs good or bad? I mean, the theory behind them is people at least get, minorities and women, get their foot in the door for the first time, and they could take it from there. So would you keep or do away with set-aside programs?
Oh, I don't think that's the history of set-aside programs. I think the history of set-aside programs are that well-off blacks become better off. If you look at these case studies of places like Atlanta, where they put in place set-aside programs for black businesses or city contractors and so forth, that's what happened. The idea that these programs are being used to lift the poor, I think, is a myth. They're sold that way, but that's not how they play out in practice. In terms of the incentives of black leaders, yes, there's some truth to that black leaders gain or benefit politically by keeping blacks riled up, angry, racially paranoid, and so forth. I think that's part of the reason why you saw an Obama indulge a group like Black Lives Matter, that it was politically useful for him to do that, even if he knows that cops are not driving, police shootings are not driving the black homicide rate in this country. It was still politically useful or expedient for him to wink at this group and say, okay, you have some points here, and I think we can, that he wasn't going to shut them down and call it the nonsense that it is. But so yeah, I think there's some truth in that. I wouldn't take the argument too far. I mean, I don't think I don't want to psychoanalyze these folks and say I think that many of these groups and many of the people on the black left are trying to help in the ways they think work. And I think many of them are sincere in thinking that more government will help blacks. And so they push big government policies, and they believe that. Or they believe that until racism has been eliminated, it can serve as an all-purpose explanation for all that ails black America. They may believe that. I don't think it's true, but I'm not going to sort of put them on the couch and say they don't really believe this. They're just pushing it for this reason.
One final note, we're going to be doing a conference with Jason in the fall, which will elaborate on many of the themes that were discussed today. But in the meantime, I wish him very good luck with this book, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.